What is up, everyone? I am Gregory LaPerche. Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be talking about Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler. This will be spoiler-free, so everyone can watch. But I will say, this isn't really a book where the reason to read the book is the plot and just being, surprised and stuff. Don't get me wrong, this book has a great plot. There's definitely a lot of emotional turns. But this book is more in the category of 1984, Handmaid's Tale, and these sort of dystopian books. Although both of these books are closer to science fiction than 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale, which are more explicitly dystopian and not really science fiction. Now, who is Octavia Butler, and why have her books been getting more popular over a decade after her death in 2006? Well, the reason is because this book takes place in 2024, and the conditions of the world are such that climate change has devastated large parts of the Earth, and specifically Southern California, which is where the main character of Parable of the Sower lives. Lauren Olamina lives near LA in a walled and gated community. And when Lauren or her parents go outside of the community, they go armed and they go in groups because of the dangers of the world around them. Now, what caused everything to be dangerous around them? Well, climate change has caused massive droughts in that area, so there is a shortage of water, and other various goods are pretty hard to come by, and there are massive levels of income and wealth inequality in this future world. There's a lack of jobs, a lack of decent paying jobs, there's drug issues and new dystopian drugs that are bad and do worse things than the drugs in the 80s did, I guess. And people are addicted to them. And so we've got themes that are really applying to our world today. Addiction, walls, massive income inequality, climate change, and then there's also racial issues and feminist issues, which are both things that are near and dear to Octavia Butler, and near and dear to the main character of this book, who is a black woman. And it's not even so much that these are, issues that exist in this dystopian future, it's that these issues play a central role in many of the things that go on with both the plot and just the world building in this dystopian future. And one of the most interesting ways that we get to see this manifest in the world is information that we get about the presidential elections. One of the candidates' presidential campaign slogan is "Make America Great Again." Maybe you've heard that slogan before, but it's not just the slogan that has a huge familiar aspect to it. This candidate has violent extremist followers who commit horrible acts against people who differ from them in their community, and in this case it is a Christian community. And basically this candidate's supporters, if you don't agree with their religious beliefs, they will do horrible things to you. And the way this presidential candidate interacts with his violent extremist followers is he distances himself and, his involvement in their radicalization. And there's some sort of equivocations going on, good people on both sides sort of stuff as well. And it's interesting. How do these people get any support in the real world? Well, this book goes through it and makes kind of a realistic seeming case for how a demagogue can get in power like that and sort of galvanize this radical, violent subsection of people to support him, but also convince people who are living in worse material conditions than their parents and grandparents that we can go back to a different society where things would be better somehow. Now, of course, the playbook is to never actually make things better. It never is in the real world, and it never is in a dystopian fantasy world either. Because the way these demagogues get support and get into power is by convincing the people at the top that they will help them. So basically, convincing the business owners that they will help their bottom line. And by business owners, of course, I mean the large businesses, as in the multi-million-dollar multinational corporations. And in this world, we could actually see this as development that could actually help the corporations. And we saw this with some of the jobs that Lauren's peers were taking or considering taking, and basically it would be these factory jobs. Now, what would these factory jobs give you? Well, you'd get water, you'd get food, and you'd get a place to live, and you'd get security as well. Now, would you get money? Would you get a decent wage? Or would you get any halfway decent amenities? Well, probably not. But because the conditions in the world are so bad, these multinational corporations can offer progressively lower and lower standards of living for their employees. And they can use this lack of paid benefits to pad their bottom line and get richer. And we see a lot of this sort of stuff in the real world as well. Real wages have gone down in the United States because people are getting more and more desperate for jobs and, living and those sorts of things. But the rich have gotten richer. The income and wealth inequality has gotten worse, and while there isn't as bad of climate change in the real world as there is in Octavia Butler's world, we are certainly heading down the path laid out in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. There certainly are droughts in California that are worse than ever, and it certainly led to some of the worst fires California has ever seen. And of course, there have been fires in other parts of the world as well. The Amazon rainforest, which was also an environmental catastrophe that benefited large corporations, multinational corporations. There were the fires in Australia, of course, and that's just fires. Obviously, like the hurricanes are worse, the flooding is worse. There are many states in Middle America where they have a horrible once-in-a-century flood, and it happens like every year. So yeah, this definitely, if you couldn't tell, isn't your standard escapist fantasy sci-fi book. However, I think if you're a sci-fi reader, you will really enjoy this. I think this absolutely belongs on the list of Handmaid's Tale, 1984, Animal Farm, sort of like essential dystopian reading. And it's almost like a warning. It's almost a prophecy. And there's like some sort of saying that something like the smartest prophecy makers don't actually predict the future. They just extrapolate things that will happen based on things that already have happened. It's the old history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes sort of argument. But we'll come back to that with the closing clips. But beyond that, I also want to just say that the way Octavia Butler writes this stuff is phenomenal, and I think it's very approachable. Like, you don't have to be super informed about political stuff to enjoy some of the political landscape that's laid out in these books, or to gain value or gain insight into some of the problems that can happen and go along with things like income and wealth inequality and climate change and other sort of political disasters. And I say this because I myself am not really a religious person, but this book does talk about religion a lot, and the main character actually makes a religion herself, and she kind of writes a sort of religious holy text called the Books of the Living. And the common saying, or the common mantra in that book is, God is change, and there are many excerpts from that book. And again, I'm not someone who spends my days thinking about religion, or spends my Sundays going to church or temple or synagogue or anything like that, but these passages were thought-provoking, and the main character is the daughter of a Baptist minister as well, and his preaching is also very interesting. And it's interesting to think about what religion looks like in a world where the material conditions are just horrible. And I mean, I guess you don't have to look at like dystopian books to get that. A lot of times when the material conditions of a country or area are worse, then that leads the religious people in that community to become more extreme and more violent. Not out of like religious hatred towards any one group, but out of material desperation a lot of times. Of course, there can be religious hatred as well. Obviously, when Octavia Butler was alive, we had George Bush as the president, who was trying to constitutionally amend marriage to be between one man and one woman. So, obviously there's religious discrimination that goes on, and it's horrible, but those people weren't violent in the way that the people at Charlottesville were violent. Not to say that everyone in Charlottesville's material conditions were atrocious, because I'm sure there's plenty of rich people that were there as well, or plenty of middle class people who are, perfectly comfortable were at those violent rallies. Anyway, that's basically everything. I will leave you with this. Octavia Butler, in an interview with Democracy Now!, kind of soft claimed that George W. Bush seems a lot like the horrible fascist demagogue of a political leader that is portrayed in this book. Now, she isn't explicitly saying that they are exactly the same or anything like that, but there are similarities, and I think it's interesting to note and interesting to look at and interesting to kind of think back on. Think about, Ronald Reagan and just, the Republican Party when Octavia Butler was writing these books. And they were explicitly exasperating income and wealth inequality. And later on, the Republican Party was explicitly downplaying and negligent and certainly nonchalant, to say the least, about climate change. They, in fact, at the time, denied the existence of climate change for the most part. I'm sure there's one Republican or something that was maybe in a state house in New York at the time that acknowledged climate change was real in 2005 or something. But for the most part, the Republican Party did not do that. And for the most part, the Republican Party has been totally okay leading us down this road that Octavia Butler has laid out in this book. And to be clear, if you're a registered Republican, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the elected leaders in the Republican Party. And one more side note before we get to the clip of Octavia Butler. It was interesting to see the opposition to this demagogue portrayed in Parable of the Sower be a very old, not charismatic, centrist technocrat sort of politician who has very little charisma and just isn't very interesting. It certainly brings back memories of opposition to the Reaganites of the 80s, and it certainly rings true to the world we live in today. So yeah, without further ado, let's see what Octavia Butler says. Like, comment, subscribe. See you guys next time.
Parable of the Sower is set in the 2020s in California. That's right, the 2020s now in California, amidst a global climate and economic crisis. Octavia Butler described them as cautionary tales.
They were what I call cautionary tales. If we keep misbehaving ourselves, ignoring what we've been ignoring, doing what we've been doing to the environment, for instance, here's what we're liable to wind up with.
Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez and I interviewed Octavia Butler in November of 2005. It was shortly after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. President George W. Bush, the former governor of Texas, was in the White House overseeing the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The Parable series, as Katrina was happening, then the aftermath of Katrina, a lot of people were talking about Octavia Butler and how the Parable series made them think about that. Explain.
I wrote the two Parable books back in the 90s, and they are books about, as I said, what happens because we don't trouble to correct some of the problems that we're brewing for ourselves right now. Global warming is one of those problems, and I was aware of it back in the 80s. I was reading books about it, and a lot of people were seeing it as politics, as something very iffy, as something they could ignore because nothing was going to come of it tomorrow. That and the fact that I think I was paying a lot of attention to education because a lot of my friends were teachers, and the politics of education was getting scarier, it seemed to me. We were getting to that point where we were thinking more about the building of prisons than of schools and libraries. And I remember while I was working on the novels, my hometown, Pasadena, had a bond issue that they passed to aid libraries. And I was so happy that it passed because so often these things don't. And they had closed a lot of branch libraries and were able to reopen them. So not everybody was going in the wrong direction, but a lot of the country still was. And what I wanted to write was a novel of someone who was coming up with solutions of a sort. My main character's solution is grows from another religion that she comes up with. Religion is everywhere. There are no human societies without it, whether they acknowledge it as religion or not. So I thought religion might be an answer as well as, in some cases, a problem. And in, for instance, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, it's both. So I have people who are bringing America to a kind of fascism because their religion is the only one they're willing to tolerate. On the other hand, I have people who are saying, well, here is another religion, and here are some verses that can help us think in a different way, and here is a destination that isn't something that we have to wait for after we die.
Octavia Butler, could you read a little from Parable of the Talents?
I'm going to read a verse or two, and keep in mind these were written early in the 90s, but I think they apply forever, actually. This first one, I have a character in the books who is someone who is taking the country fascist and who manages to get elected president, and who oddly enough comes from Texas. And here is one of the things that my character is inspired to write about this sort of situation. She says, "Choose your leaders with wisdom and forethought. To be led by a coward is to be controlled by all that the coward fears. To be led by a fool is to be led by the opportunists who control the fool. To be led by a thief is to offer up your most precious treasures to be stolen. To be led by a liar is to ask to be lied to. To be led by a tyrant is to sell yourself and those you love into slavery." And there's one other that I thought I should read because I see it happening so much. I got the idea for it when I heard someone answer a political question with a political slogan. And he didn't seem to realize that he was quoting somebody. He seemed to have thought that he had a creative thought there. And I wrote this verse. "Beware, all too often we say what we hear others say. We think what we are told that we think. We see what we are permitted to see. Worse, we see what we are told that we see. Repetition and pride are the keys to this. To see and to hear even an obvious lie again and again and again may be to say it, almost by reflex, then to defend it because we have said it, and at last to embrace it because we've defended it, and because we cannot admit that we've embraced and defended an obvious lie. Thus, without thought, without intent, we make mere echoes of ourselves, and we say what we hear others say." just one more comment on the human condition, I guess.